Some fighters are just made for one another. Some pairings are just so technically even that 100 fights between them could result in 100 wildly different outcomes. It's pretty rare in MMA to get a rivalry quite like the one shared between Deiveson Figueiredo and Brandon Moreno. After 3 riveting battles for the flyweight title, it doesn't seem like we're any closer to getting a definitive answer about who of the two is the greater fighter. Sure, each man brings attributes to the table that can help him in getting the upper hand exchange by exchange, fight by fight, but the Figueiredo-Moreno problem is one that still needs to be solved. In the 4th round of the very first fight these two shared, Jon Anik voiced his sneaking suspicion that we might see these two run it back before too long. Little did he know that the greatest rivalry in the history of the flyweight division was being born before our very eyes. A fight that would dominate the division's title discussions for the next 2 years. And with the 4th fight now set for the UFC 283 co-main event, the stage is set for a matchup that will hopefully bring us closer to getting our answer. But let's jump back a few years, because as much as we love celebrating these 125-pound standouts, it's easy to forget that there was a time that saw the flyweight division's future hanging in the balance, where Dana White stood with the executioner's axe above his head, ready to sever all ties with the weight class. In those days, the longtime champion Demetrius Johnson was so damn good.
I don't think there's a doubt in anyone's mind that you are the pound-for-pound best fighter the world has ever known.
So technically masterful that he was making his contenders look average, like the whole division was lacking. Add in the small physical size of the flyweights, and somewhere along the way, Dana White was able to convince the fans that the division itself was the problem, and that the UFC would be better off without it. Henry Cejudo, who became the first man to defeat Mighty Mouse in years, was credited as being the man who saved the division from this fate. But he left the 125-pound ranks as soon as he had pulled off his greatest moment in the weight class. No, in our book, as much as Cejudo deserves a boatload of credit, the long-time health of the 125-pounders has been ensured by the rise of the UFC 283 co-main eventers Deiveson Figueiredo and Brandon Moreno. Both men held UFC gold in recent times, and each man brings something different to the table for the fans to latch onto. The champion Figueiredo is an athlete who breaks through all of the issues some people had with the lightest male weight class. People said that there wasn't enough legitimate knockout power in the flyweight division, and that the chances of seeing a KO were dramatically lower than in the other divisions. Well, as the time has gone on, more than a few people have been forced to eat their words. Pound for pound, there are few hitters quite as devastating as this Brazilian powerhouse. Figgy hits with the intensity of a man far larger than he is. That type of power that almost shocks people when they experience it. Guys like Joseph Benavidez, who have truly seen and done it all, were thrown around the cage like they were getting a hit by a middleweight. And for the division, having a champion rise up who had a penchant for destruction, that just made the idea of a flyweight title fight more exciting than it had been for years. And it was the rise of Figueiredo that made Brandon Moreno's ascent what it was. We all love a good underdog story, and from the very first moment this young fighter's name was made known to us, he was already being written off. Moreno's first appearance on the flyweight season of The Ultimate Fighter saw him seated 16th in the tournament, meaning the showrunners believed that he was the most unlikely fighter to win the show outright. And he didn't win the show. In fact, he didn't even win his first fight, losing after a valiant effort against the future top contender Alexander Pantoja. Moreno would get his shot in the UFC though, but after posting a 3-2 record, back-to-back losses to Pantoja once again, and Sergio Pettis saw this Mexican prospect get cut from the promotion. And in 9 cases out of 10, that would have been the end of Brandon Moreno. At this point in time, Figueiredo had started his assault on the flyweight title, beating Team Elliott and Alexander Pantoja to earn a 2020 shot at the belt. He would miss weight on the scales, but still dominate Joseph Benavidez for the win. The rematch was then set up, and Figgy would come in with a vengeance, battering Benavidez on his way to a brutal and sometimes difficult to watch first-round finish. His follow-up title defense against Alex Perez further solidified this man's appeal, his position as one of the most exciting champions in the sport today. The flyweight division needed a king like this, but even more than that, it needed a fighter who could push him to his limits. While Deiveson was on the rise, Moreno was forced to go back to the drawing board, After his UFC release, he was given a title shot in LFA, and in June 2019, he was able to get himself back into the win column with a 4th round finish of Michael Perez. And then something very strange happened. Once the UFC realized that the flyweight division was going nowhere, they decided to try and repair some of the damage they had done with their extensive roster cuts. Moreno was given a second chance, and you would best believe that he took it gladly. After drawing with Askar Askarov in his comeback fight, Moreno went 3-0 against 3 of the very best 125-pounders on the planet: Kai Kara-France, Jussier Formiga, and Brandon Royval. And though everyone counted this young, hard-nosed contender out against the unstoppable power of the champion Deiveson Figueiredo, what we got in that first fight was easily the greatest bout in the history of the 125-pound division. Every great champion needs someone to bring the best out of them. Look at Alexander Volkanovski and Max Holloway, Kamaru Usman and Colby Covington, and even John Jones and Daniel Cormier. What we got at UFC 256 that night was the perfect collision of the two fighters who would drag the division into its new era. And the way Moreno stood up to the fearsome punching power of the champion was truly remarkable to behold. That first fight may have only been scored as a draw because of a point deduction to Figueiredo, but what it did do was set in motion the chain of events that would give us a rematch. If the first fight was a back-and-forth thriller, the second was a coming-out party for Brandon Moreno. With the confidence of knowing that he could go 5 hard rounds with his rival, the challenger went out there and walked Figueiredo down, showcasing his own power in the process by scoring a number of huge knockdowns before forcing the tap with a trademark rear naked choke. He looked like a different animal entirely, no longer the underdog who was simply happy to be involved. No, this version of Brandon Moreno had the swagger of a champion, and by the time all was said and done inside the cage, he had the belt to show for it. Was Figgy suffering due to a tough weight cut? There's certainly an argument to be made. But what matters here was that there was a fresh new face sitting at the top of the flyweight pile. A marketable and incredibly likable young man who had thrown down the gauntlet to the next flyweight contender, opening up the division in a way that we haven't seen since its inception. But Deiveson Figueiredo was not done just yet, not even close. Their razor-thin trilogy fight came next, and it was a bout that was edged out by the Brazilian through his power, his timing, and his incredible grit. He outfought Moreno over 5 rounds to sneak away with a decision victory. All of a sudden, the rivalry standings became incredibly murky. The first fight was a draw that was technically 3 rounds to 2 in favor of Figgy, with the point deduction making it a stalemate. The second was dominant for Moreno. The third was close once again, but served as a victory for Figueiredo. So far, we have 2 fights that Figueiredo probably got the better of, and one that Moreno decisively scored the victory in. The flyweight division definitely needs to move on, needs to give its contenders a chance at UFC gold. But after Moreno dealt with Kai Kara-France in the interim title fight in the way that he did, the UFC's hands were tied to some extent. Ideally, Kara-France or any of these other contenders would have drawn enough attention to themselves to find their way into a title shot. But when the time came for Kara-France to take on Moreno, Brandon was able to prove his level in there. And all things considered, virtually no one was complaining when the UFC decided to book the 2 best 125-pound fighters on the planet for a 4th collision. Never before in UFC history have the same 2 fighters fought 4 times for the same title. And it goes without saying that no undisputed title has ever been contested by the same 2 fighters 4 times in a row. But if that doesn't give you a sense of how special this pairing is, nothing will. UFC 283's co-main event should give us an answer to the burning question of who will lead this division into its next era. But after seeing those guys in action for over a dozen rounds, don't be surprised if this fight leaves the fan base wanting more. Both men have immense high-level experience, both have the power to hurt the other, and each has proven that they can recover from even the most difficult positions. This is the defining fight of the modern-day flyweight division, folks, and whether the belt goes home to Brazil or Mexico, these 2 men have engaged in a saga that will be talked about for years to come. Let's just hope the January 21st showdown in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil gives us a showdown worth remembering. Although something tells us that the UFC cannot mess with these 2 involved.